This second box of Shaw Brothers titles from Shout Factory covers the first half of the 1970s. It's films from 1970 through the mid-70s. And like the first set, it focuses mainly on the wuxia genre, which was, of course, rapidly displaced by unarmed combat films, kung fu films, from the early 70s onwards, thanks to the influence of Bruce Lee and the huge success of Bruce Lee over at the rival Golden Harvest studio. And Shaw's had no choice but, of course, to follow suit. But they continued making wuxia films, swordplay movies in a more classical vein, but with modern touches, of course, throughout this period, and indeed longer. Zhang Jie went back to it after his long flirtation with unarmed combat movies. And so the situation was in some flux. This set contains a number of outstanding titles. It has the first two parts of the trilogy that Shaw Brothers made from the classical Ming Dynasty novel The Water Margin, which tells the stories of a group of outlaw rebels. Became a source book, a source text for countless Chinese action films, as well as comic strips and all kinds of other sources, other media. They made Water Margin, followed by Delightful Forest, and there's a third part which is not on this set called All Men Are Brothers, which was another translation title of the original book. This also contains Man of Iron, which is one of Chen Guantai's best ever performances as a star, and it's credited to Zhang Jie, but it was largely made, I think, by his cinematographer Bao Xueli. And another film that was made by Zhang Jie and Lau Ka-leung called Heroes 2, which is the beginning really of his Shaolin cycle, which goes on to dominate the next several years of his output, guided, I think, by Lau Ka-leung. Anyway, this is a fine picture which had an immediate sequel, not on the set, called Men from the Monastery, but it's the beginning of a new focus on Shaolin martial arts, which comes to dominate much of Zhang Jie's output. Now, there's one anomaly on this set, one film that doesn't fit this pattern, one film that has nothing to do with wuxia traditions, really, and that's a film called Bride from Hell. It's a pretty rare example of a kind of horror movie, or horror fantasy, let's say. I don't think most viewers nowadays will come to it finding it very horrifying. I don't think that's the kind of film it is really. There are a few shock moments in it, but they're fairly tame by the standards of the modern times. But it'll stick out as a kind of anomaly. It doesn't look or sound like most other Shaw Brothers films of the early 70s, and you won't recognize any of the faces in it. None of the big Shaw stars is in this picture. Why is that? Because it's a Taiwan film. It was made in Taiwan. It was financed by Shaw's, but made with Taiwan talent. All the personnel behind the camera and in front of the camera are Taiwanese, and most of them won't be familiar to you at all. Why was this film financed by Shaw Brothers, and why was it released as a Shaw Brothers picture, although being made many miles away from the Shaw Brothers Movie Town studio in Hong Kong? The prime reason, I think, is economic. At the time, late 60s, early 70s, Taiwan had the Taiwan dollar, and Taiwan was a major market, a major export market for Hong Kong films. At the time, King Hu, amongst others, who had, of course, run away from a Shaw Brothers contract, was working in Taiwan from about 66 through 1970, and he made his biggest ever hit, a film called Dragon Gate Inn, and his biggest ever flop, or at least initially, a film called Touch of Zen. So Taiwan was trying to fight back against the dominance of Hong Kong cinema and doing it with talents imported from Hong Kong to a large extent. Uh, However, Hong Kong films did rely on Taiwan theatre chains for much of their income. The problem was that income was in Taiwan dollars, and it was not convertible, it was not exportable in an easy way. So Shaw's, like other film companies, had a lot of money stashed away in Taiwan as Taiwan dollars, which they couldn't export back to Hong Kong or convert into US dollars or anything else. So it was a good strategy, which I guess Shaw Brothers was one of the first to develop this strategy, if not the first. Spend the money in Taiwan, make something in Taiwan, which itself can be exported, and hope that the film will earn foreign currency wherever it plays, and that will be convertible and it will benefit the Shaw coffers. This is a tradition that continues for quite some time. Golden Harvest does it, Cinema City does it, and we have this situation to thank for a number of important films. I mean, Edward Yang's first film, That Day on the Beach, was made entirely in Taiwan because of money belonging to the Hong Kong company Cinema City, which was sitting in Taiwan and was unexportable. They basically financed the film and owned it for Hong Kong and for export, although they didn't do much with it. So it's a syndrome which existed at the time. The director of Bride from Hell, Zhou Xujiang, was a Taiwan director. He's a sort of curious figure, and it turned, I mean, I did a bit of research on him for this introduction, and he's quite elusive, quite tricky. There's very little online about him. We don't even know that he's dead. I think if he was, we're talking in 2023. If he's alive, he'd be 98 years old. So I think it's unlikely that he's still with us. But you know, who knows? He might be a very elderly gentleman sitting somewhere in Taiwan. He was born in Shanghai in 1925, I've discovered. And his family came from Zhejiang, which is the inland province not very far from Shanghai, so this is not a surprise. And he, like many, fled from Shanghai to Taiwan in 1949 when the communists won the civil war in China. He's part of that large exodus to Taiwan. And when the Republic of China, as the nationalists had called China at the time, transferred from China to Taiwan. And Taiwan still sometimes calls itself the Republic of China. He had some kind of artistic experience or theatrical or writing experience in Shanghai before he left, apparently. I mean, he was by that time in his mid-20s. In Taiwan, that went further, and in the mid-50s, apparently, he started doing odd jobs in the Taiwan dialect film industry, which is a very small, very ramshackle, and it must be said, not very accomplished branch of Taiwan filmmaking. There's not much very professional filmmaking in Taiwan at the time. 10 years later, mid-60s, he begins to work in the Mandarin film industry in Taiwan, which is coming up. The government has a policy. They've realized that they are not going to leave Taiwan anytime soon. You may have seen in some Taiwan films that the mainlanders who arrived in 1949 or in the early 50s didn't expect to stay in Taiwan. They thought they would retake the mainland. That was the propaganda meaning of the messages of the time. And by the end of the 50s, they were beginning to concede that this was not going to happen, that they were in fact stuck in Taiwan for the duration. So one of the side effects of that was that a Mandarin film industry came into being in Taiwan under direct government pressure. So the government, the nationalist government, the Kuomintang, KMT, um, founded a film company, founded a studio in Taipei, a big studio, which probably still is, the best equipped studio in the whole of Taiwan. And they had the largest theatre circuit as well. So they were the dominant force, and they used that power to produce a certain number of anti-communist propaganda pictures, some pictures about the Civil War, about the valiance of the Kuomintang troops and things like that. But they also produced a lot of entertainment pictures, and that became I guess, the dominant current in Taiwan film industry from about 1960 onwards. So, as I said, our director, Mr. Zhou, joined this, moved from Taiwan dialect films, very ramshackle, very indie, into a more mainstream Mandarin language film industry in the mid-60s. So he started directing soon afterwards. His first film seems to have been in about 67. I can't tell you anything about his work. I mean, none of it, or hardly any of it, has survived, or hardly any of it is accessible now, I should say. It may well have survived somewhere, but I don't know where, and none of it has been published on DVD, really, except for 2 films that he made with Shaw Brothers money for Shaw Brothers release. He benefited twice from this arrangement. Maybe more times. I've only been able to establish that it happened twice. In 1970, he made a film for Shaw's, which was subsequently published on DVD in Hong Kong, when DVDs became a thing, when the Shaw Brothers library was finally opened up. And then this, Bride from Hell, was the second one. It was not unknown for Shaw Brothers to have to produce what you might think of as horror fantasy films, ghost stories, and the reason for that is that there was a source book available to them, which is one of the places they turned to for material for their stories. Shaw's was always a very mainland-focused company. To a large extent disengaged from Hong Kong. It wasn't until the 70s that Hong Kong social, cultural realities became a big thing in Shaw Brothers movies, because it was a resolutely mainland-focused company. It did produce a certain number of films in Cantonese, a small number, but its major efforts, and certainly most of its budgets, were dedicated to Mandarin language films. Which is why it was easy to make a connection with Taiwan, of course, as well, because Taiwan is basically Mandarin speaking, or has been since 1949. So this Taiwan movie, Bride from Hell, fitted neatly into the kind of production program that Shaw's were pursuing. There is a kind of Chinese horror tradition. It's not been a big thing in Chinese cinema until comparatively recently, but it was always a presence. And it was inaugurated in the 1930s by a director called Ma Xu Weibang, who himself became an emigre to Hong Kong after the Civil War and continued working in Hong Kong through the 1950s. Now, there are 2 routes for what you might call the horror tradition in Chinese culture. The first is a book. This is the book I refer to. This translation, which is by far the best in English thus far, is called Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio, translated by John Minford, an academic, I think now based in Australia, and is the most comprehensive and best translated so far of the Chinese original. The book, the Chinese title is Liao Zhai Zhi Yi, and it was first published something like 50 years after the author Pu Songling's death. That's in the early Qing dynasty. Pu Songling was born in 1640, That's just 4 years before the Ming dynasty fell and was replaced by the Manchu Qing dynasty. And he continued working through the early decades of the Qing dynasty. Pu Songling famously passed the first imperial exam for a post in the Chinese civil service with flying colours, with distinction. He got, A grades, as it were, in everything. But after that, failed every subsequent exam, so never advanced in career terms. He had to make a rather paltry living as a tutor, a private tutor to other educated families. But he spent a lot of time on his own compiling this book. And he learned bits from friends, he picked up folklore here and there, he recycled earlier literary sources, he did all kinds of things to compile a massive anthology of uncanny and often supernatural Chinese tales. He put together nearly 500 of them in total. Initially, in his lifetime, they were circulated privately to friends in handwritten copies. As I said, it was first published as a volume, or series of volumes, about 50 years after his death, well into the Qing dynasty by this time. It remains in print. There have been attempts to rewrite it in modern Chinese, not very happy and not very successful, and certainly not very well regarded. There have also been some very useful commentaries published on it, trying to clarify the roots of some of the stories and trying to explain some of the references in them. And attempts have been made to translate it. The first major attempt to translate it into English was by a man called Herbert Giles, who is one of the originators of the Wade-Giles transliteration system of Chinese. He was, which was the dominant thing until Pinyin came along in the 1950s. Herbert Giles was a Victorian. He published what he called Strange Stories from a Chinese studio in 1880. And he was very much constrained by the codes and rules of the time, the late Victorian period. That's to say, he made a selection of stories from the 500 or so, or nearly 500 in the original collection. He translated them probably very skillfully, actually, but he also Bowdlerized them. He cut out all the sex, basically. Most particularly, he cut out all the gay stuff. There's quite a lot of gay sex in the original stories. I say quite a lot. It's the dominant sex in the stories is heterosexual, but there's an equal. None of the stories is surprised when sexuality takes a gay turn. Let's put it like that. So there's quite a lot of incidental references to gay fantasies. Many of the stories are about romances between solitary men, usually scholars, sometimes younger sons of well-born families, who are wandering through rural China, usually with a servant in tow, and who happen upon a beautiful woman who turns out to be a fox spirit. And they are cajoled into marriage or relations because the fox spirit is trying to regain her human form by sucking life force from the man. Now, this will be a familiar story to you if you've seen a later film from the mid-80s called A Chinese Ghost Story, which in turn is derived from one of the stories in Pu Songling's collection. Distantly, of course, it must be said. It's been thoroughly updated, modernized, and given all kinds of modern spin, like Taoist rap, which I think was not part of Pu Songling's repertoire. Anyway, this compilation of 500 stories, there's a rumour that somebody in France is translating the whole thing, all 500 of them. John Minford, in this edition, has done just over 100 of them and says in the introduction that he wants to do more, hopes to do more in the future. But he made his own selection here. But he is, of course, not governed by the kind of constraints that Herbert Giles faced. So he doesn't need to edit out any of the sex. He doesn't need to edit out any of the gay stuff. And he tries for a certain kind of balance and variety and to illustrate the literary range of the original stories. So anyway, this volume sits as a source book, a source text, a huge resource, in fact, for anybody, any Chinese artist who wants to pursue supernatural themes, or themes of the uncanny, the mysterious. And this had certainly hit Shaw Brothers already in the 1950s, when Li Hanxiang, who was their first real star director at the newly opened Shaw Movie Town in Hong Kong, established by Run Run Shaw, the youngest of the brothers, Li Hanxiang wanted to make a ghost story, chose a tale from Liao Jai, from Strange Stories, Strange Tales, as John Minford has called it, and made a film called Enchanting Shadow. It is the archetypal story. The lonely scholar wandering happens upon a girl, is seduced by her, becomes enamored of her in all kinds of ways, but she is in fact a ghost. If this sounds familiar, it's because, of course, it's the same story as a Chinese ghost story made all these years later in the mid-80s. And the Chinese ghost story is, in fact, a remake of Enchanting Shadow. It uses the same story, and if you see Enchanting Shadow, it's difficult. It is out on DVD in Hong Kong, so it is possible to track it down. You'll be surprised about how similar the two films are in certain ways. Obviously, there are big differences too. But the basic story is the same, many of the themes and the characterizations are the same, and the Taoist who comes to the rescue in Enchanting Shadow is every bit as eccentric as the Wu Ma character in a Chinese ghost story. So you'll find that there are quite a lot of direct parallels. I hinted earlier that there's another tradition in Chinese horror fiction, and that was inaugurated, as I said, in the mid-30s, in fact just before Shanghai fell to the Japanese in 1937, by a really eccentric director called Ma Xu-Weibang. Ma Xu-Weibang was a true one-off. He was a singular figure who was apparently quite eccentric, rather like Kim Ki-young in Korea, actually. As weird and offbeat and hard to assimilate as that. But he made his mark in the mid-1930s with a film called Song at Midnight, which is a version of the Phantom of the Opera story. No attempt to disguise it. He just took the story, Gaston Leroux's story, and did a version of it in Chinese terms, but with quite a lot of borrowings also from Frankenstein movies, specifically James Whale's Frankenstein movie of the very early 1930s. And it turned out that James Whale was a huge influence on Ma Xu-Weibang, and that became even more apparent when, during the Orphan Island period, Shanghai, in 1937, when the Japanese shelled Shanghai and invaded the city, they took over what had been the Chinese sector of the city. There were also foreign concessions in Shanghai, owned by colonial powers, Britain, France, etc., which were left alone by the Japanese initially and were not assimilated until 1941, after Pearl Harbor. Basically, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, they also took over the rest of Shanghai. I'm sure everybody has seen Empire of the Sun, the J.G. Ballard memoir that was filmed by Spielberg. It's about that time. It's exactly about the moment when the rest of Shanghai was taken by the Japanese and Westerners were interned in camps, prison camps. Now, before that happened, Shanghai, as I said, the Chinese sector of Shanghai fell to the Japanese in 1937. Between 1937 and 1941, the film industry sort of continued under Japanese supervision, But it was what's known as the Orphan Island period. It's when Shanghai was Gudao in Chinese, the literally Orphan Island. The Shanghai film industry functioned under rather benign supervision by Japanese powers, and made a certain number of films that were considered to be, well, they weren't propaganda films. Let's put it like that. They were not. They certainly weren't anti-Japanese, which had been the dominant current of 30s cinema in Shanghai before the city fell. But they were entertainment, but they were designed to either highlight the weaknesses in Chinese culture and tradition, so that the Japanese could claim to be, healing, solving problems that existed in China, or they were entertainment designed to distract people from the fact of Japanese occupation. Ma Weiban stayed in Shanghai during this period. He's not one of the ones who ran away along the Yangtze River to Hankou and ultimately to Chongqing, cities further inland which were safe from the Japanese, never fell to the Japanese. And in Shanghai he made a sequel to Song at Midnight. Song at Midnight 2, you could call it. Ye Ban Ge Sheng Xu Ji, Part 2, or continuation. And Part 2, which is a very interesting film if you ever get a chance to see it. It's not. The China Film Archive has rather locked it up again, having briefly let it out years ago, because it does have a lot of nudity and other, rather sensational elements in it. It has the mad doctor in the film, for example, has a dummy of a woman in his bed, which he, who knows what he gets up to with this dummy, but at one point in the film, he shatters it. And he also has real-life nude women posing as statues in the bedroom, so with thin wisps of diaphanous cloth, barely covering their modesty. So these are surprising things to see in a Chinese film of 1941, but they are representative, let's say, of Ma Weibang's perversity, and also representative of the strong influence that he inherited from James Whale, because this one is based even more than the first one on Frankenstein, possibly with elements of Bride of Frankenstein, James Whale's own sequel to the first one, as well. So there's even a figure rather like Ernest Thesiger in Ma Weibang's sequel. So you have a second channel of influence into Chinese horror fiction, which is from Hollywood. James Whale was the first, but not the last. And as Hollywood continued, basically horror was a genre that came into focus because of Universal Pictures. Also ran of the early studios around the time of the transition to talkies, and Universal carved a niche for itself as producer, purveyor of classic horror fiction. They started with Dracula, making both an English and a Spanish language versions of it with different casts. They followed with Frankenstein, and as you don't need me to explain, they went on to Wolfman, Invisible Man, and more. So other studios rushed to cash in. Warner Brothers makes Dr. X, and MGM makes Mad Love, and basically all the major studios find themselves doing at least the occasional horror movie after this. That never happened in Chinese cinema. The major companies didn't feel the need to rush in and all make horror movies in that vein. And so Ma Weibang really stood by himself as the pioneer of the genre from the point of view of Hollywood influence. Ma, I don't think, drew anything from Strange Tales from a Chinese studio. He was not, that was not what rang his bell, floated his boat. He loved James Whale films, and he wanted to do the Chinese equivalent of those films. I think when he went to Hong Kong in 1949, he continued doing that in the Mandarin language film industry in Hong Kong through the 50s until his death. So I remember, and I start to draw my own memories in the 70s, when you looked at other horror fantasies, like Enchanting Shadow that I've just described by Li Hanxiang, they draw not on Hollywood, but on the Liao Jai, the strange tales tradition. In fact, they literally base themselves on little vignettes in the book. And that tradition continues. As I said, a Chinese ghost story made by Choi Hak and Qing Xiudong in the mid-80s is specifically based on a Liao Jai story. So the Hong Kong film industry remains alert to this tradition and keeps drawing on it when it wants to.
今天我遇到一个阴阳道士，他说你是鬼。
The key thing in the early 70s, from I guess 73, was the global success, including in Hong Kong, of a film by William Friedkin called The Exorcist. Suddenly, Hollywood horror influence became a very big thing again, pretty much for the first time in Chinese cinema since the 1930s. And suddenly you get a flood of imitations of The Exorcist. I myself saw one. Jackie Chan's manager, in the years before he became Jackie Chan's manager, the late Willie Chan, was then partnered with a Cantonese filmmaker called Cheung Sum. And they made all kinds of mostly very lowbrow comedies, with Willie as the producer and Cheung Sum as the director. But in 74, that same team made a Chinese rip-off of The Exorcist. All they did was take the basic plot of The Exorcist, transpose it into Buddhist terms, and restage it in modern Hong Kong as a Buddhist fable. The key thing was modern Hong Kong. The idea that horror could exist in a modern environment, that was the thing that came from The Exorcist. It soon translates into other things. I mean, Shaw Brothers starts to make a different kind of horror movie. For example, one of the very first it makes in 74 in the modern vein is a film called Ghost Eyes, directed by one of its contract directors, Gui Chi Hong in Cantonese. And it's a film about supernaturally endowed contact lenses, if you need to know. It doesn't matter particularly, but the film is not a great film, but it's interesting for being the first real attempt to do something that we'd recognise as a supernatural thriller, set in the present day, coming out of Shaw Brothers. And that in turn is, I think, very much influenced by the success of The Exorcist. It's not a rip-off of The Exorcist, but until The Exorcist had demonstrated the popularity of present-day horror fiction set in the present, I don't think Shaws would have considered making this film. So they did. It was written by Ni Guang, who is, as I'm sure fans know, Zhang Che's regular screenwriter for all of those wuxia films and kung fu films that he went on to make. It established a string to Gui Zhehong's bow, and Gui Zhehong became, in the following years, right through the early 80s actually, the leading director of horror fiction at Shaw Brothers. Not the only one. He didn't want to. He followed up Ghost Eyes with a film called Killer Snakes, starring Gam Gok Leung, which is more social commentary than horror film, actually. It's about what we would now think of as an incel. I mean, somebody a lonely man who hates society, has been discriminated against and pushed down all his life, who develops a kinship with snakes and uses snakes as agents of his vengeance on society at large. He starts sending out snakes to deal with his enemies. or the people he thinks have oppressed him. That's also quite a striking film, and certainly very weird and odd film in many ways. Meanwhile, the modern horror tradition is picked up in a series of films by He Menghua, who is another old Shanghainese man working at Shaw Brothers as a kind of genre hack. I mean, he's doing all kinds of films, from romances and wuxia films and adaptations of classical fiction through to modern horror stories. And he makes a series of films also written by Yi Guang called Black Magic. Black Magic is, well, Shaws are still nervous. You can tell about setting black magic practitioners, people casting love spells, death spells, this kind of thing, in modern Hong Kong. So they are very happy to relocate the action to Southeast Asia. In this case, I think nobody says at any point in Black Magic where it's taking place, but visually the clues are it's in Malaysia. And everybody in it is Chinese, they all speak Chinese, everything, there's no hint of anything non-Chinese in the picture, but the setting is not Hong Kong. You can see it's not. The buildings are very unlike Hong Kong. There are palm trees everywhere. It's kind of, it's clearly somewhere tropical in a way that Hong Kong is not. So that fits a pattern. When Gui Qihong returns to the genre a bit later with films like Hex and two sequels to Hex, ultimately a film called The Boxer's Omen, which is his swan song in the genre, and very disgusting and shocking it is, actually, that film. It's full of deliberate attempts to disgust. It goes quite a long way beyond John Waters, for example. He also turns to other countries in Asia. So Boxer's Omen, for example, is a Thai movie. It's set almost entirely in Thailand, although there's a finale set in Nepal. So the action starts in Hong Kong, but then moves crucially to Thailand, and, as I say, finishes up in Nepal. From the beginning, actually, Shaw felt slightly uneasy about putting black magic or supernatural themes into present-day Hong Kong. And that was felt by other people in the genre. So you'll notice, everybody knows, I think, that it was martial arts directors, people who specialized in martial arts, like Sammo Hung, like Lau Kar Leung, who started to explore horror themes in their action films. Sammo, I guess, was the first, with a film called Encounters of the Spooky Kind, in which he plays a Taoist exorcist in a battle with a rival. It's a kind of horror comedy. I mean, it has some serious horror shocks in it. It has some serious elements of pain and damage, but it's basically funny. And that's because Sammo Hung, I think, saw himself, largely because of his physique and weight, as being funny, inherently funny. So when he appears naked, for example, with a strategic something blocking his private parts, he thinks that's going to be amusing. And this is something picked up by other martial arts actors and choreographers, like Jackie Chan, for example, who in his second or third feature as a director goes out of his way to have nude scenes and hands inadvertently coming close to groping him and that kind of thing. It's standard ploy for the genre. People think of comedy and horror going hand in hand. A certain refinement of the genre is developed by Lau Kar Leung in a film that in English is called Spiritual Boxer Part 2. A ridiculous title because it has nothing to do with the original Spiritual Boxer, which was Lau Kar Leung's first feature as a director. And is the film that introduced in the mid-70s the notion of, it's set in Hunan, which is where this legend arose, the legend of hopping corpses. subsequently developed in many, many other films, notably the Mr. Vampire series from Hong Kong. What these films have in common is that they're period pieces. They're set in old feudal China. That means they come from the strange tales tradition. They draw on stories found in Bu Songling's anthology. They make use of old superstitions. They look at them humorously. They think it's often ridiculous, but at the same time they are happy to deliver the odd real scare or jump or shock. So when we look at modern horror stories in Hong Kong, of which there are quite many, we're looking at Hollywood influence primarily. Hollywood's influence via The Exorcist and subsequent films. Willard was, for example, a big influence on killer snakes. Willard was about rats, if you don't remember. That's one vein which dominates films with modern settings. For films with older settings, films set in the distant past, the mythological past, the imagined past, even simply just Republican China. I think Hex, the first part of the Hex trilogy, is set in early Republican China, so about the 1920s, let's say. And that also has borrowings. It doesn't have, it's not a Liao Jai story, I don't think, but it does have quite a lot to do with Kwaidan, the Japanese film by Kobayashi. In particular, Hochi the Earless, which is one of the episodes in Kwaidan, where Hochi is painted, he's stripped naked and his body is painted with Buddhist sutras in Chinese. That happens also in Hex. It's copied rather directly, in fact, so it's rather clear that Kwei Chi Hong has been looking at the Japanese original here. And in fact, Japanese horror has increasingly reached Hong Kong screens at the time and is becoming more of an influence, I think, on some directors in Hong Kong. Kwei Chi Hong is probably the most important one. Japanese horror has also come to Japan via both a domestic tradition of haunting. There is again a literary source. It's not as old a one as Liao Chai is in China, but it's nonetheless there. And there was a foreigner called Lafcadio Hearn who collected ghost stories and horror stories, mysteries, little vignettes of various kinds, the inexplicable, supernatural in Japan, collected them from all kinds of sources. And that becomes one of the sources for a series of Japanese ghost fantasies, including famous ones like Mizoguchi's Ugetsu Monogatari. The other tradition, though, is Hollywood. And the first director who really picks up on this, when you look at Ma Xu Weibang in China, in Shanghai, you think it takes a certain kind of maverick personality to pick up this stuff and to try and transplant it to a domestic culture like China's or Japan's. In the case of Japan, it was a director in the 1950s called Nakagawa Nobuo, then working for a small outfit called Shin Toho, formed by people who'd broken away from Toho Company because there was a big strike and overpay, basically, and it proved to be impossible to solve. So the breakaway employees from Toho started something called Shin Toho, which means new Toho. Not very subtle. And they produced basically low-budget genre films through the 1950s into the 1960s. And that was where Nakagawa found a home. He started to make horror movies. And he made strongly Western-influenced horror movies. Actually, he drew also on some old Japanese folk traditions, and he did recycle some ideas like ghost stories of Yotsuya Kaidan, which is probably the story that's been remade most often in Japanese fiction. Well, that and Loyal 47 Ronin are the two, I suppose, most frequently recycled, but there are many, many, many versions of the Yotsuya ghost story tale. And Nakagawa did some of those, but he made a film set in Japan where The streets all have numbers, rather like American streets. I mean, as you know from Japan, no street in Japan has a number or name. Japan, in fact, one of the reasons Japan is so confusing is that there is no tradition of street names, and so it's quite hard to find anything in Japan. You need maps for everything. You need landmarks. You need to know it's near this building and it's a bit to the left and that kind of thing. So Nakagawa freely invented a vampire story set in Japan and made it so Americanized that even the streets had numbers in this story. He wasn't disguising at all the foreign roots of this kind of thing. So Nakagawa developed both classical horror fiction and modernist horror fiction with a strong Hollywood influence, and that fed into later films. It fed into films of the 60s, including the old leftist director Shindo Kaneto. Became famous for films like Onibaba and then later Kuroneko, Black Cat, all starring his wife and usually set in the feudal past. They're samurai stories essentially, and he drew on very much the same kind of roots that had been established in the 50s by Nakagawa. Nakagawa saw out his career with a film called Jigoku, Hell, which is a kind of Dante's Inferno thing, a Buddhist version of Dante's Inferno, where the sinners, evildoers, wrongdoers, morally compromised of the present day find themselves torn apart from the society they know and love and thrust into the hellfires, where they suffer untold humiliations and tortures. It's not very well realized, but it also had a strong impact in Japan and was remade, inevitably, in this case by Ishii Teruo, and the remake is, I think, even worse than the original. Nonetheless, all of this stuff is reflected in Hong Kong, it's seen in Hong Kong, and it's not accidental that a director like Gui Chi-hong draws on it, feels inspired by it, and works with it. So you have a polyglot tradition of horror fiction in China. You have, first and foremost, the Liao Jai Strange Tales tradition. As I said, it became a lasting source book for supernatural Chinese fiction, and it still is. So still now, there are films being made that go back to this source. The second Hollywood influence, which comes into Chinese cinema in the 30s with what's happening in the Shanghai film industry through Ma Xu-Weibang, and is then picked up by him, or brought by him to Hong Kong in the 1950s. And then you have a renewed wave of Hollywood influence sparked by William Friedkin's The Exorcist from the early 70s onwards, which translates into a genre at Shaw Brothers. Now, all of this is, so it's all very polyglot, and we shouldn't neglect either the influence of the Japanese tradition, which has some of the same roots as Hong Kong, old folk tales in their culture, plus Hollywood borrowings in their culture. But that becomes yet another source of influence for the Hong Kong filmmakers in the 1950s and 60s, as these films are seen in Hong Kong. Let's go back, finally, to Bride from Hell. We've explained why the film got made, how it was financed by Shaw Brothers in Taiwan, how it's a Taiwan production. It must be said that the film is exactly like many stories in Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio. It has precisely the dynamic of one of Pu Songling's tales. The only twist is the ending, which I'm not going to reveal because it would be a spoiler, I guess, but it does have a slight twist in the very final scene of the picture, which is a bit different from Pusung Ling. It takes it into a different direction. It's to do, let me just say, with point of view. That's all I'll say about it. It's not a film with direct sequels. It doesn't have a strong influence on anything. It doesn't seem to have been a particular hit at the time. The director, as far as I can discover, never worked in Hong Kong itself. He didn't come to Hong Kong. He gave himself an American name. You'll see on the credits of the film, he bills himself as John H. Chow, rather than Zhou Xu Jiang, his given name, as it were. But anyway, he made, in total, from what I've been able to discover, about 15 films, directed about 15 films, worked on quite a few others before that in other capacities, like writing assistant, production assistant, that kind of thing. And then disappeared, stopped, made his last film at the end of the 70s, 79 I think, and then we know no more about it. There's nothing I've been able to discover about what happened to him after that. Since he evidently retired from filmmaking, I think it's fair to assume that there are no more films. He had no further involvement in the film business. And by 79, things were falling apart in Taiwan. It was when, I think some of you will know this, it's when the new wave has its first splashings on the shore of Taiwan cinema in the late 70s. It's when Hou Xiaoxian begins directing initially pop music films, film vehicles for pop stars. And then soon after, in the early 80s, the new wave actually appears, and Hou Xiaoxian makes different kinds of films, much more socially conscious and much more ambitious aesthetically. And people like Edward Yang start to appear, and the whole orientation of Chinese cinema in Taiwan changes. And so I think that the disappearance of a director like Mr. Zhou probably reflects the exhaustion of the old production situation and the way that he steps down because a new generation is ready to move in and make a very different kind of cinema in Taiwan. Nonetheless, odd that one little film on this box set of basically wuxia films should provoke all of this, but maybe it will encourage you to explore a bit further. I have a couple of sources to draw to your attention if you are interested to take this further. Many years ago, in 1989, the Hong Kong Film Festival organised a retrospective of films of this genre called Phantoms of the Hong Kong Cinema. I think this book is still in print. You can probably find it if you dig around, or at least online, and it's definitely worth a look. It contains some very amusing essays and quite informative. And also, if I mentioned earlier that Gui Zhihong, or Gui Qihong in Cantonese, was probably the most important director in the genre from the mid-70s onwards through to the early 80s. And the Hong Kong Festival also published a collection of essays and thoughts about him. This one, a slimmer volume, published more recently, it's called Gui Zhihong, The Rebel in the System. And it's a fine piece of work, actually, very informative, with some collaged together, different interviews with him collaged together, lots of words from the director himself, now dead, sadly. He stopped directing films when Shaw's closed down regular production, and he emigrated to the States, where he ran a restaurant, I believe, and then sadly died. So he left us. I met him, and he was an outspoken rebel. It's not a surprise that his later films went into the area of social and political commentary while disguising themselves as genre films. So he was the first person I met in Hong Kong, back in 77 this would be, who said to me that he resented growing up in a British colony. I think my comment was, well, it's probably better than growing up in China, given what China's been through in the last 10 years, the Cultural Revolution. And he wryly kind of agreed with that, but it didn't alter his distaste for living in a colony and for having a not very accountable colonial government and administration. and hence his rebellious spirit, I think it's fair to say. And I was quite impressed that he was the only person I met on that trip who said things like that to me, and it indicated that he was something of a rebel at heart. Anyhow, let's hope that your taste of Bride of Hell leads you to a wider exploration of the horror tradition in Hong Kong cinema.